What's going on, guys? My name is Jacob, and today I want to talk about pivoting versus unpivoting data. Now, my presentation is going to be from the perspective of Power Query and Power BI. I'd like to walk through some of the interface there and just kind of understand how to interact with the data from that sense. But I hope that the definitions that I present will be applicable across any data interface or data program, data language that you use where pivoting and unpivoting is applicable. So as a data analyst or someone who's worked on a computer, specifically in Excel, I'm sure that these terms are somewhat familiar to you. For me, working in Power Query, oftentimes I would just do a lot of trial and error until I got the data to look correctly, when really I just needed to step back, think about the definition of what pivoting versus unpivoting means so that I can do it right the first time and do it confidently. All right, so I'm going to lay out some basic definitions and then we'll get into some examples. But first, pivoting. What does that mean? So pivoting data basically means taking tabular raw data and summarizing it or aggregating it or rearranging it in some way for the end user output. Now I say tabular raw data, what does that mean? So basically tabular data is data where each element of your data is presented in its own column. So for example, maybe you have an analysis of product sales by month. So one column would be the product ID or the product name, another column would be the sales dollars, and then another column would be, for example, year month. So you've got each element kind of siloed to its own column. What this tabular raw format presentation allows us to do is easily aggregate and summarize and reorganize data using pivot tables or pivoting. Now, on the flip side, think about a situation where it's the same data that we're analyzing. So you've got product in column A, and then across the top as headers, you have each year month name. So think about it in chronological order. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but below that, you've got the sales totals associated with each month at the intersection of the month and the product, so that you can see trends over time for each product. Now, this is a great end user presentation of the data, but it's not tabular raw data. To be tabular data, you'd have to have each element of your data siloed in its own column. So for example, sales. Well, in this instance that we're laying out, this pivoted instance, sales is spread across however many months are available in the data. So you don't just have one column that has sales dollars, you have 12, 24, however many months we're analyzing here. And in turn, the months column, which should also be a field when it comes to tabular data, is actually column headers. So ultimately, this is data that is presented not in a tabular data format, but rather a format that requires pivoting. This is what you would call pivoted data, or maybe you're familiar with matrices or a matrix. And a matrix is basically where you can define the row element or elements, the column element or elements, and then a value that you apply an aggregation to. Typically it's a sum, but you can do really any aggregation, min, max, count, so on and so forth. This would be an example of pivoting data. Now, I know that this might be going over some people's heads. To others, it might seem fairly straightforward, but we're going to get into some examples here in a second so that all of this becomes much clearer. Let's go ahead and hop over to my desktop and we'll start working through an example in Power Query. All right, guys, as you can see, I've got Power Query Editor pulled up with an example query of some made up data. As you can see, it's got product and customer data broken out by the sales totals by month. And as you probably have already gathered, this is presented in a pivoted format. So what called me to that was that there are multiple column headers that contain this kind of date format across the top, and then underneath you've got sales dollars represented across multiple fields. We talked about earlier how tabular data formats have a single column per attribute. So for the sales dollars in this instance, that would be all contained within a single column, as well as in this instance, the column headers, which are year month or the month begin date, that would also be contained in its own column. So this is not tabular data, this is pivoted data. So let's, through the lens of Power Query Editor, obviously approach this example with the goal of unpivoting the data and presenting it in a tabular format. So what I want to do is basically unpivot all the sales dollars and the column headers that contain the month begin date. Now to unpivot is to combine all the values from the columns that we select into a single column, and then to extract the field titles and present them within their own column as an identifier or attribute field. So let's go ahead and select all of these columns that contain the sales dollars detail. And then what I want to do is under the transform section, I can click this unpivot columns. Now I can also right click and there's this unpivot columns option here. For whatever reason, there is not a pivot column option under this right click menu, but there is an unpivot columns option. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. And as you can see, we still have our product name and customer name column, but now we have this attribute column, which contains date information, and then we have our sales dollars. Now, it looks like I did something kind of weird with the formatting and the source, and I really should have conformed all the formats in an earlier step, so I can just quickly change these to what they should be at this point. All right, and so now we've got tabular data. So again, not to beat a dead horse, but one attribute per column. So we've got the product name, we've got the customer name, we've got attributes, which should really be, we'll call this year, month, and then we've got the sales dollars. This is probably the way that many of you are used to being presented data. This is really how all data in Power Query should be formatted so that you can easily aggregate and organize things in the canvas. Obviously, there's exceptions to that depending on your use case, but typically this is what we want to get things back to before we close and apply. Now let's hop back a step real quick, or a couple steps. If I come back to this step, when I selected all the columns that contained the sales data, you notice when I right click that there's also these unpivot other columns and then unpivot only selected columns. I'm going to ignore the unpivot only selected columns for now, but if I wanted to instead take the approach of selecting the attributes outside of the sales dollars and then right clicking and clicking unpivot other columns, I could take that approach, and as you can see, it gets the same result. All right, I'm going to hop back up to this step again. As mentioned in the intro, oftentimes I just kind of guess and check until the data looks right. As far as pivoting and unpivoting, I didn't want to take the time to just think about the definitions, but at this point, it really is helpful to think that to pivot a column is to take the distinct values of the column you've selected and create new columns with the names or values. So I'm actually going to jump back to the end step where we have the tabular data. And for the sake of switching it up, let's pivot by customer name. So if I were to right click, actually, like I said, the pivot option is not available when you right click, but under transform, you can click it right here, pivot column. It kind of helps define what you're doing along the way. So when it says pivot column, it says use the name in column customer name to create new columns. And then you define the value columns here. So again, when you're pivoting a column, you are summarizing data by the column that you've selected to pivot on. And when doing this in Power Query, as you can see at this step, you have the option to choose the associated value that'll get displayed in said column. So here it just defaults for whatever reason to product name, and when you break out advanced options, it just defaults to count. That's a quick note. Whenever it's non-quantitative data and you choose that as the value column, when you're pivoting, it defaults to count. Obviously, it can't sum, something that's formatted for as a text, for example. But instead of the value column being product name, let's go ahead and select sales. And then whenever it's quantitative, it will default to sum as I want it in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we're presented with a different pivot view or matrix, if you will. So before we had the year month across the top and the customer down the y-axis, and now we've basically just swapped those two by pivoting on the customer rather than year month. So it's still very similar in the sense that the intersection of the product name and year month and customer results in the sum of sales, whereas before it was the intersection of product name and customer over to the year month. So just kind of a different way to look at it, but I do like it in this sense. There's not too many customers. If you're dealing with thousands of customers, obviously this wouldn't make any sense. And it really doesn't make sense for that matter in Power Query at all. We're just kind of messing around in here because, like I said, it's a best practice to always close and apply with data in a tabular data format. Now I know we're just kind of string along steps here, but instead of deleting the last step, let's go ahead and select product name and year month, and then we're going to right click and say unpivot other columns. And now we're back to our tabular data. Now something else I want to call out is that there are some tooltips available. So for example, if you hover over pivot column, use names in the currently selected column to create new columns. Tables with nested columns are not supported, so there's a little description there. If you drop down the unpivot columns option, you get the same for each of these as well. That's all I've got for today, guys. I hope that you found this video around pivoting and unpivoting data to be useful. Obviously, it's not groundbreaking. We're covering some age-old topics as far as data goes, but it's good to step back to consider these definitions, and I hope that you do the same as you work in Power Query or whatever tools you might be using. All right, guys, see you in the next video.